Okay, so first of all, l'chaim, everybody. L'chaim. Okay, so I became very absorbed in a particular issue in the past few weeks. I wanted to share it with you, and I have a feeling that you may have discussed this in other contexts, but I think I have a unique sort of path in this topic. Did you have a class in which you're going through Mark Shapiro's book on you know fundamental belief, anima, I think he calls
Yeah,
it.
we're
Josh
doing
Berman. We're doing Josh Berman's book, Anima, yes.
Oh, Berman's book, not Mark Shapiro's book.
No.
right.
Ah, okay, Beseder. Oh, that's good. Okay, so I want to take a look at the issue of anthropomorphism, that the notion that God is not physical. And I first have to make a confession. You ready for a confession of my sins? They're multitudinous. And one of them is the following: that in thinking about Christianity, after a very careful exploration of the concept of the Mashiach, I've always felt that the notion that somehow the difference between Christianity and Judaism, among many other things, is the belief in Jesus, that somehow that's like Jesus is Messiah, as if that's somehow some kind of fundamental parting of the ways. And while it is a parting of the ways, what's more significant, it seems to me, is the notion that God becomes a human being, right? And that's idolatry. And that's much more profound than whether or not a particular historical figure was the Messiah. So I'd like to even draw into question this notion that the that God taking human form is somehow out of the question in Judaism, and that somehow impinges upon the belief monotheism that Judaism espouses, that's somehow the parting ways of Christianity and Judaism, and that's an intolerable belief. I'd like to take a closer look at that idea.
Rabbi,
Okay. Yeah.
so we just had in this week's Parsha where the angel, which we would have called an angel, said, I am telling, he's speaking like in the first person. Almost like, I, God, I'm telling you whatever's going on. So he's taking the form of a human being. I mean, it's
Yeah.
whatever that means.
Yeah. And what we're going to quote this week's Parsha in a second, you'll see. So thank you. That's just adding to the question. So let's first take a look at the sources in the Torah, which seem to emphatically state that God doesn't take human form. So we have a famous pasuk in Devarim, Moshe's parting words to the Jewish people: "V'nishmartem od lenafshotechem." Should guard yourselves very carefully. Ki lo re'item kol tuna b'yom diber Hashem Elokeichem b'chorei mitoch eish. For you didn't see any image in the day that God spoke to you at Horeb, at Mount Sinai, from the fire. Right. In other words, the experience of Mount Sinai is the most intimate encounter between God and the Jewish people. And I think that generally speaking, in Jewish thought, that was a kind of one-time, particularly intimate and direct encounter. So intimate and direct that there's a whole discussion exactly what the whole Jewish people experienced. In terms of the Ten Commandments, was it the first two? Was it more, etc.? It was so intense that the Jewish people could not bear to be in such an intimate presence of God. And Moshe says, now think about that. That was our most intimate connection with God, and yet there was no physical representation of God. Right? So that's that pasuk there. And then, of course, when we look in the later prophets, we see a great emphasis on this idea. We could bring hundreds of psukim, but just sort of emblematic psukim. So Yeshayahu, Isaiah, says, "El mi tidamyuni be'eshveh yomar kadosh." Right? To whom then will you liken me that I should be equal? Right? For those of you who know more Hebrew, so dimayon means domeh, right? Something similar. Dimayon is imagination, right? You can't even imagine me. I'm incomparable. right? I'm beyond anything that the imagination is capable of conjuring up. And then we have another pasuk in Yeshayahu, very famous. We have a fast day coming up. This is read on fast days. Ki lo machshavotai machshavotechem lo darchechem derachai nu Hashem. Right? My thoughts are not your thoughts. My ways are not your ways. I'm not part of human experience in the normal sense of what human experience is about. I'm utterly other with a capital O. Okay. Now, this week's Parsha. So, Bruce, you raised the problem from this week's Parsha. I want to start with the assertion in this week's Parsha that reinforces this idea of God being utterly transcendent. So when Bilam utters his prophecy, he says the following. He took up his parable and said, "Rise up, Balak, and hear. Listen to me, you son of Tzipor. God is not a man that he should lie, nor the son of man that he should repent." Now, by the way, I actually don't like that translation, and I would have chosen a different translation, but just didn't have time. Because it's not so much that he should lie or that he should repent. Right? The real notion in the Hebrew is to say things which God would regret. Right? God changes his mind. God doesn't change his mind. Right? Now, of course, you could right away think of all kinds of passages in Tanakh which seem to indicate that God does change his mind. We'll get to that later.
This Parsha again. In this
sorry.
God,
this was we just read it yesterday.
Yeah, God changed his mind in the Parsha.
Yeah. So.
Oh, don't go, don't go. I mean, it's like.
Yeah. So we'll get to the problems later. But right now, just to see that there are these assertions that God is utterly other, like I said before, and he doesn't have human emotions, he doesn't have human thinking, he doesn't regret decisions, etc. Now, I know right away you can think of all kinds of exceptions, including perhaps this week's Parsha that we read yesterday, last week's Parsha. Let's actually start with some of those exceptions. So we have right in the beginning of the Torah, with the creation of the human being. God says, let us make man in our image and in our likeness. Make man in our image and our likeness. Tselem, demut. God has a likeness, an image. Now, obviously, this is not a new problem. And when you look in the commentators, you'll see that they all deal with this issue. V'yinachem ki asat adam ba'aretz v'yit'atzev el libo. Another famous passage in the Torah. That's right for the flood. So, v'yinachem Hashem ki asat adam ba'aretz. God regretted that he made man in the land. V'yit'atzev el libo, and he became sad, atzuv. Now, that's pretty interesting considering the fact that we just saw a pasuk in this week's Parsha. It says that lo ish el v'chazeh ben adam v'yitnachem. He's not a person who changes his mind. V'yitnachem, that exact verb. So it happens to be in Breshit that God says, or the Torah says about God, v'yitnachem Hashem. Right? God changed his mind that he created the heavens and the earth. What a mistake. I'm going to just press the delete button. And we could quote many, many psukim, just a few more. These are sort of the most shocking ones. In Shmot, Vayu et Elohei Yisrael. They saw the God of Israel in the context of the giving of the Torah. V'tachat raglav k'maaseh livnat sapir k'etzem hashamayim l'toar. That they saw God, and underneath his legs was this sapphire something, brick, stone, and it was like pure like the heavens, whatever that means. And then Yeshayahu, Ver'et et Adonai Yoshev o kisei ram v'nisa. I saw God sitting on this exalted throne. Prophet Zechariah, Einei Hashem heim mishotetim b'chal haaretz. God's eyes hover over all the earth. Okay. For God being utterly other, he certainly seems to be described in very graphic human terms. Let's just take a look at some of the passages in Talmudic literature, which are extremely problematic. I mean, this is Masechet Brachot. How do we know that God puts on tefillin? Quotes the pasuk from Yeshayahu that God took a vow at his right hand and in the forearm of his strength. Whatever that means. Don't ask too many questions about how that's a proof that he puts on tefillin, but this notion that God puts on tefillin, that's weird. Now, right away, of course, you're thinking, yeah, these are metaphors. You don't have to take it literally. Not so simple. Let's take a look at another passage in Masechet Brachot. My mitzale. So the Gemara asks, God davens. What does God daven when he davens? So it answers, Yehi ratzon milfanai. May it be my will. Right? We usually say Yehi ratzon milfanecha. May it be your will. But God has to daven to himself, since he's God. So may it be the will before me, sheyichbeshu rachamai ka'asai, that my mercy should conquer my anger. Vayagolu rachamai amidotai. Similar idea, that my mercy should be able to overcome the other character traits, which might make me want to punish the Jewish people. Vetnaeg im banai b'midat rachamim, and that I should be able to relate to my children through the attribute of mercy. That kanes lehem lifnim mishut hadin, I should behave with them beyond the letter of the law. So God davens to himself that he should be able to have anger management. I'm Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha. The Gemara goes on that Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha said the following: One time he was a Kohen. He went in to light the incense in the Holy of Holies. And I saw a Katriel, and the Ritva said, I put it in there, Shmo Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's one of God's names. So he walks in there, he sees God. Wow. Okay.
Isn't the head of all Torah institutions called Katriel? It's a bit presumptuous. Calling yourself the name of God is a bit over the top, right?
That is good. Yeah, that's true. That Rabbi Brander. Yeah, his name is Katriel. So, Yah Hashem Sochu Yoshevo Kisei Ram Venisa. Right? God, this Kohen, he saw God. He calls him Katriel, and then he says immediately, Yah Hashem Tzvaot. Right? He says, that's why the Ritva said it's God. Right? Because it says in the Gemara that he saw Katriel, and he was the Lord of hosts. What was he doing? Shu Yoshevo Kisei Ram Venisa. He was sitting on his throne. Of course, that's an image that we saw in Yeshayahu. V'amarli Yishmael b'ni baracheni. And God said to the Kohen, Yishmael, can you do me a favor and give me a bracha? God asked for a bracha from this Kohen. Amarti lo. So I gave him a bracha. Yiratzon milfanecha. May it be your will, that your mercy should conquer your anger. And it goes on with the same bracha we saw that God blesses himself, right? That your mercy should overtake all your other attributes, and that you should be able to relate to your children with the attribute of mercy. And God shook his head. That's how the bracha, that's like God saying amen, I suppose. Okay. Not too surprising. We're used to these types of passages. Let's take a look at what is perhaps the most shocking text that is probably from Talmudic times. There's some questions as to the exact dating of this text. That's the text called Shiur Koma. Shiur Koma. So Shiur Koma means the measure, and Koma might mean the stature of God, though there's a question that koma actually could mean body, not stature. Whatever, it doesn't really matter for our purposes. And let's take a look at some quotes here. Rabbi Yisrael said, "What is the measure of the holy and blessed be He who is hidden from all creatures?" Like, it sounds like we're to take God to the tailor. We've got to know his measurements. The sole of his feet fill the whole world, as it is said, "The heaven is my throne and the earth is my footstool." That's Pasuk Mishayahu. Now, in case you want to know more specific measurements, since you may be a Schneider, you're a tailor, you're going to make a suit for God. The height of each soul is 3/10,000 thousandths of parasangs. That's high. The sole of his right foot is called, and you notice that there's just gibberish here. That's because in Hebrew it's also gibberish. Just consonants. It's letters written that don't mean anything, as far as we can tell. And his left sole is called, whatever that is. From the sole of his feet to his ankles, the height is 1,000, 10,000s, and 500 parasangs, and the same for his left ankle. The name of the right ankle is gibberish. The name of his left ankle is gibberish. From his ankles to his knees, the height is 19,000, 10,000s, and 4 parasangs, both right and left. The name of his left leg is gibberish, and of the right leg, gibberish. Gibberish to me, at least. The height from his knees to his thighs is 12,000, 10,000s, and 1,400 parasangs, both right and left. His name is gibberish. The right thigh is gibberish, left thigh is gibberish. From his thighs to his neck, the height is 24,000, 10,000s of parasangs. The name of his loin of loins is something incomprehensible. On his heart are inscribed 70 names, incomprehensible. And then finally, something we do recognize, Baruch Shem Kvod Malchuto Le'olam Ved. Blessed be the name of glory, his kingdom forever, because we just said God's name, all those letters. So he said Baruch Shem Kvod Malchuto Le'olam Ved. His neck, 13,000, 10,800 parasangs is the height of his neck, which name is the roundness of his head. That number has a name. His beard. God has a beard. Well, okay. 11,500 and 5 parasangs. His name is blah, blah, blah. Okay, fine. So now we have a problem. On the one hand, we have psukim, which indicate God being utterly other, beyond any human conception. On the other hand, we have myriads of psukim, which speak about God in very physical ways. And we have in Talmudic literature dozens and dozens and dozens of images describing God in very physical ways. And then the most shocking, the Shir Koma, which tells us the dimensions of God. You know, it's one thing if you have a story like we saw in the Talmud Masechet Brachot, that the Kohen goes into the Holy of Holies and has a conversation with God, that God blesses himself, or the Kohen blesses him, that the God's compassion should overcome his anger, etc. So those kinds of texts convey some kind of moral or spiritual message of God's loving kindness, overcoming the attribute of strict justice. Okay. Except for when you read Shir Koma, like, where's the message? No message here. And just trust me, I went through the whole thing. There's no message. It's just God's dimensions and weird names. So what I do now.
Well, isn't this text a forgery? I mean, Rambam says it's a forgery.
Yeah, so it's probably not. According to current academic scholarship, it's not. Now, I understand why the Rambam would want to say that, and I also understand why Rav Sadion, which we're about to look at, we'll see what you're referring to there. But according to contemporary scholarship, I'm not talking about in the yeshiva world or anything like that. I'm talking about in the academy, right? Gershom Sholem or Yosef Dan, and on and on. Apparently, this is a bona fide text that's part of the famous Heichalot literature of Kabbalah, particularly ancient, apparently from Talmudic times, maybe even times of the early period of the Mishnah. That's current scholarship on that. So not so easy to get rid of. So let's take a look at how some of the great thinkers dealt with these issues. We'll start with Rav Saadia Gaon, who deals with this a lot. And this is Rav Saadia Gaon, very famous from the 10th century. Kvar hevi b'mevucha achadim b'nei adam inyan Moshe Rabbeinu hayach sha'alat Hashem hareini na'at kodecha. So now he has chapters and chapters dealing with the problem of anthropomorphism. This is just a little selection because I wanted to just show you how the bottom line, how he copes with it in a way in which you'll see later on he's attacked viciously. So he mentions that other people were confused by the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu asks to see God. Hareina et kodecha, show me your glory. What do you ask to see? Omar Bezrat Harachaman, and I've explained with the help of the All-Merciful. Begilui Kozeu Biro. I've explained this whole issue of what it means to ask God for His glory. Yeshlem Zohar, Shu Boreoto. There's a kind of radiance that God creates. Umbegaleu Lenevim, and God reveals that radiance to the prophets. This is a really fascinating answer because he's saying that the prophets, Moshe Rabbeinu in this particular case, they did see something. It's not just some type of abstract concept. No, there's a real thing that they experienced, and it's called Zohar, this divine radiance. But notice how he says, Shehu Boreoto, God creates it. So you notice something interesting, according to Rav Saadia, when we see something that seems to be a kind of incarnation of God, some kind of physical embodiment of God, it's not God, according to Rav Saadia Gaon. It's something that God creates. And through it, a person can experience God's message, right? As he goes on to say, God does this because he wants to make sure that the prophets know that it's really God speaking to them, right? Because they just heard a voice that was a complete abstraction. They might think that they drank too much vodka. So God gives them this kind of mystical experience where they see this Zohar, this radiance, this some kind of light, miraculous, and then they hear the divine voice. They know that, wow, that's really God speaking to me. And then the prophets, when they experience this Zohar, this physical manifestation of God that God creates, they say, I saw the glory of God. Because they did. They saw the kavod. But according to Rav Saadia, the kavod is not God. It's this light that God created. And through that light, God conveys his message in order that it be very real and tangible, that the prophet will believe that this is really something that's not a figment of his imagination, but it's actually coming from God. And sometimes the prophets will say, I saw God. Now, they didn't really see God. They saw the kavod, Kavod Hashem. And what's the kavod? Excuse me. It's this supernatural light, the Zohar, which is a creation of God. It's not God. Kamishpat hamilim anistarot. Aval haborei atzmo ein afshut sheyirehu shum adam. But the Creator himself, it's not possible for any person to see God. It's impossible. It's impossible philosophically. So claims Rav Saadia Gaon. So these mystical experiences of an angel that seems to be God, speaking in God's name. And Bruce, like you mentioned today, according to Rosadia Gon, it's not God. It's this creation of God that acts as kind of the mouthpiece, as it were, of God. This kind of mystical Zohar, this mystical radiance that the prophet experiences. So far, so good. Any questions or comments on this? Okay. Now, I want to go to the Rambam. I started Rav Sadia because Rav Sadia lived before the Rambam. So let's take a look at the Rambam. And here I have an English translation here. This is the Rambam's 13 principles of faith that are found in his commentary in the Mishnah. Very famous. The third principle, denial of his physicality. That's the third principle of faith. And that is that we believe that this unity that we mention is not a body and not the power of a body, and that actions of a body do not relate to him, not in his essence, not in his doing. So God doesn't have a body. He doesn't act as a body. He doesn't act physically in the world. God is not a thing. And hence the sages, may their memory be blessed, denied the possibility of his composition and dissolution and said, above there's no sitting or standing, no backside, and no weariness. It's a famous passage from the Talmud that deals with Elisha ben Abuya, the famous heretic who went into the orchard, which is to say no dissolution, and that is no backside, right? That's the term used in the Talmud that she's interpreting, and no composition, and that is weariness, as interpreted here by the Rambam, right? God doesn't get tired, and he doesn't decompose because he's not a thing. Anything will ultimately decompose, and God is not susceptible to that. Okay. And we'll just skip a bit. And the prophet said, we saw this already, and to whom do you compare me, and I be equated? Said the Holy One. But were he a body, he'd be comparable to other bodies. And everything that comes in the Holy Scriptures that describes him in physical ways, such as walking or standing or sitting or speaking or similar to it, it is all by way of metaphor. Everything's a metaphor that describes God in some kind of physical terms. And so did the rabbi say, Dibra Torah Lashon B'nei Adam, very famous expression, that Torah speaks the language of people. And the sages already spoke much about this manner. We'll see something very shocking in a few minutes about this. And the third principle is indicated by that which is stated, for you did not see any image, right? We saw that verse in Dvarim when Moshe says, you were at Mount Sinai. This was this intimate encounter with God, and there was no image. Which is to say, you did not perceive him as something with an image because he is, as we mentioned, not a body and not the power of a body. Okay. The Rambam discusses this elsewhere. Someone's going to say something?
Now, why do we think that hearing the voice is fundamentally different from seeing a vision?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So the famous German commentator on the Torah, Benno Jacob, so he asked the same question. He said that a voice is no different than it's also anthropomorphic. God has a mouth, God has vocal cords, right? So I think the answer to that is, from the Rambam's perspective, it isn't different, right? Even when it says that God speaks to Moshe, the Rambam says this explicitly. It doesn't mean he speaks to him like we speak, we speak to each other. But at the end of the day, we need some words to say God communicates, so we just use a word for communication to speak. But we give the same answer. The Torah speaks the language of men. But just put that on hold for a second, because it's not so simple. Let's take a look at a few more sources of the Rambam. Here again, more Nebuchim. The incorporeality of God has been demonstrated by proof. Those passages in the Bible, which in their literal sense contain statements that can be refuted by proof, must and can be interpreted otherwise. This is a general principle in the Rambam, which is the supremacy of logic. Right? The fact that God doesn't have a body, from the Rambam's point of view, is logically impossible. If he had a body, he would have component parts. He would be subject to disintegration, and that cannot possibly be true of God. Whatever the philosophical proofs are, it's not important for our purposes today. And then he makes his general point that anytime you have a passage in Tanakh which conflicts with logic, you have to interpret that pasuk to harmonize with logic. This is a pretty amazing and strident passage here. And we've discussed this many times and in many different contexts. The famous passage where he discussed this at length is his beef with Aristotle concerning, did creation occur? Right? Aristotle said no such thing as creation. Right? Matter always existed. The Rambam says that he doesn't think the proofs are compelling on the side of Aristotle. But if they were compelling, he would believe it. And the fact that Torah begins with Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim v'ha'aretz, God created in the beginning heavens and earth, he would interpret it some other way, which is a pretty radical empowerment to be able to interpret the Torah, even when it's so blatant and simple that creation is part of Jewish belief. God created existence. The Rambam's willing to reinterpret even that if he was convinced by logic that matter always existed. Now, let's take a look at how he codifies this. 5 individuals, this is from the Hilchot Shuvah, the Mishnah Torah, law code. 5 individuals are described as minim, non-believers, heretics. Okay? One who says there's no God, nor ruler of the world, one who accepts the concept of a ruler, maintains there are 2 or more, one who accepts that there is one master of the world, but maintains he is a body or form. Well, if one says that God has some kind of bodily form, you're a heretic, with all the implications of being a heretic. Fine. Now, I want to take a look, this is rather long, to see how another of the Rishonim deals with this issue, Sefer Ikarim. So Sefer Ikarim is written by Rabbi Yosef Albo. He lives after the Rambam, and he disagrees with the Rambam about the Rambam's assertion that there are 13 principles of faith. He thinks, hang on one second, he thinks there are principles of faith, but he thinks there are only 3. Okay? I'm sorry, someone's going to say something? Yeah. So let's take a look at how he deals with this issue. We'll take a look at a little bit of it. It is proper, however, to say this in justification of those Jewish scholars who deal with the subject. Every Israelite is obliged to believe that everything that is found in the Torah is absolutely true. And anyone who denies anything that is found in the Torah, knowing that it is the opinion of the Torah, is an unbeliever, as the rabbis say in Parachelik. And anyone who says the whole Torah emanates from the divine being, except one verse, which Moshe said on his own authority, is liable to the imputation charged in the biblical expression. Which biblical expression? Because he hath despised the word of the Lord, and is classed among those who deny the divine inspiration of the Torah. Now, here Rabbi Yosef Albo is saying that don't think that there aren't any beliefs in Judaism. There are beliefs in Judaism, except for what are the beliefs that are absolutely fundamental and clear. So the Rambam has a very strident, expansionistic conception of what are the fundamental beliefs of Judaism. Rabbi Yosef Albo is more limited in his understanding of what are the fundamental beliefs that if you were to remove one of those, that the entire Judaism would collapse.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
Are these people responding to the society they lived in, whether it's Muslim or Christian, and they never would have written anything like this if not for where they were living, or do they believe these things independently of their societies?
Yeah. So it's a good question. It is absolute fact that in general, we don't see a kind of systematic presentation of Jewish belief until the Middle Ages. That's a fact. Now, there are certain passages in the Talmud that say things like, what is the verse upon which all of the Torah rests? Things like that. But that is not a systematic presentation of fundamental beliefs of Judaism. It's only the Middle Ages. And so one could argue, and it has been argued, that it's a response to, as you said, Bruce, to contemporary, meaning in the Middle Ages, attempts by Christians and Muslims to develop the creed of their faiths. And then Judaism defends itself by creating its own systematic presentation of belief. Now, so assuming that that's true, and it probably is true, that doesn't mean that the articulation of those beliefs is somehow weak. Right? It's just that those beliefs, according to these medieval authors who create a credo of Judaism, they felt that it wasn't, for some reason, in earlier generations, those beliefs were there. They're all embedded in Tanakh and in rabbinic literature. It's just that there wasn't a necessity to organize it in some kind of systematic way. Now, there are academics who feel that there's no such thing as fundamental beliefs in Judaism. It's sort of orthopraxis, right? As long as you do the mitzvahs, you can believe whatever you want to. I think it's a strange thing to assert that. And one of the things that makes them think that, which I believe that's not correct probably, is that how come we don't see earlier attempts at very clearly defining what are the fundamental beliefs of Judaism? Even the Torah, it's not 100% clear that the Torah is so concerned with fundamental beliefs. And so therefore that leads these academics to say that it's kind of an artificial imposition upon Judaism. But I think that by and large, the center of gravity among academics is to think that there are fundamental beliefs. It's just a little hard to know exactly what they are. And there are debates about them. And Rabbi Yosef Albo, I think I'm just going to put Rabbi Yosef Albo on hold because it'll be better to take a look at him in respect to the controversy over the Rambam's fundamental beliefs. Now, I wanted to show you something that was already mentioned. The most outrageous example of anthropomorphism we saw coming from this work, Shi'ur Koma, right? God's dimensions. Just want to show you something. We won't be surprised. We already see the view of the Rambam and the view of Rosh Gaon. I want to show you that they were asked about this themselves, about this book, Shi'ur Koma, which was alive and well in their days. The Rambam says in a tshuva, someone asked him a question, what do you think about this book? Matter of fact, let's read in English, I only have the answer. Let's read the question. It's an interesting formulation of the question. She'ela, question. V'yorenu hadrato gamkein. So the person who asked this question says, may your honor instruct us about the following. What do you say about this issue of this book, Shi'ur Koma, God's dimensions? Is it like some people say that's from the Karaites? This is this heretical sect among Jews that in the Rambam's time was alive and well and was apparently quite a threat to rabbinic Judaism, which it rejected the oral law, Talmudic Judaism. So is it like, maybe it comes from the Karaites? Umasarzot b'shem hadratchem, hu sod misodot achachamim. Or maybe it's some kind of mystical work, esoteric wisdom from the sages. Shebo inyanim atzumim. There's these deep ideas that are embedded in it. Tivim o Elohim. Maybe he's dealing with secrets of the natural world, physics, or metaphysics. That's what he means by Elohim. Kmo shemar Rabbeinu Hai be'echad kuntrasim b'shelul chagiga. And he quotes Rav Hai Gaon apparently had held that it is an authentic Jewish text. It just has, it's just encoded secrets about physics or metaphysics. And now here's what the Rambam answered. I never thought that this came from the sages. Heaven forbid, we're assuming that this kind of thing derives from their hands. Rather, it is undoubtedly no more than the work of a Byzantine preacher from Christian period. All in all, it would be a highly meritorious deed to snuff out this book and to destroy all memory of it. That's his very moderate opinion about this work, Shir Koma. I think it's ironic that the Rambam's own works were subjected to being snuffed out and destroyed by people who didn't think that his works were particularly kosher. And Rav Saadia Gaon also, let's hear what he has to say. He says, there's no agreement among scholars about Shir Koma, right? Because he knows about Rav Hai Gaon, apparently thought it was a Jewish work, authentic, representing authentic Judaism. It's just that it's a deep philosophical secret work, either doing physics or metaphysics. For it appears neither in the Mishnah nor in the Talmud, right? We don't see Shir Koma being quoted anywhere else. We can't find it anywhere in Mishnaic literature or in Talmudic literature. And we have no way of determining whether or not it comes from Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Yishmael is quoted in Shir Koma, or whether someone else composed it under his name. For there are many books which use the name of people who did not write them, but were composed by others who made use of the name of one of the great sages in order to attain prominence for their works. Right, so this is pretty interesting. Rav Saadia Gaon says it could be a forgery. He's not sure. And after all, the fact that it's attributed to Rabbi Yishmael, there are a lot of books like that. We call them pseudepigrapha, where we attribute it to certain people to give it authority, like Sefer Hanoch and many other examples. So people take it seriously, but it's a forgery. And so, Arthur, this is what you're mentioning in terms of being a forgery. So Rav Saadia Gaon entertains the possibility it could be a forgery. The Rambam considers it a pure heresy, and it should be burned. But like I said, the modern academic world actually considers it to be not a forgery. It's part of the Jewish mystical literature, among the oldest examples of Jewish mystical literature. But now I want to get
is the Zohar on this list of contentiousness about its authorship?
For sure. Absolutely. That's something maybe when I'm brave enough is to do a whole analysis of thinking about the Zohar and the historical its historical context. Now, the way these anthropomorphic passages are dealt with, either we reject them, like in Shir Koma, so outrageous that the Rambam rejects it completely, and Rav Saadia Gaon, not sure. But the other things which are not so easy to reject, like Tanakh and rabbinic literature, Chazal, Mishnah, Talmud, Midrash, not so easy just to say that it should be burned, right? So everybody in this kollel knows that the classical way we deal with these sources is to say, don't take it literally, that it's metaphor, and as Bruce already pointed out, even saying God spoke to Moshe, can't take that literally either. So, Dibra Torah Kelashon B'nei Adam, the Torah speaks the language of men. That's a very famous principle. We all know that principle. And it is the convenient principle found in the Talmud itself, which allows us to deal with all of these troubling psukim. There's only one problem. It doesn't mean that. The Torah speaks the language of men doesn't mean what everybody thinks it means. So I'm going to show you one example of the Talmud's use of that expression, Torah speaks the language of men. And you just have to trust me on this, at least right now. You can go look it up after we're done. Every single example in the Talmud of that principle, the Torah speaks the language of men, is exactly like the example we're about to look at. Okay, in order to appreciate this passage in the Talmud, we have to take a look at a passage in the Torah. First says the following. This is in the book of Bamidbar. But the person that acts presumptuously, whether he be born in the land or a stranger, that person dishonors the Lord, and that soul shall be cut off from among his people. Right? The Torah, that soul be cut off. Now, in case you fell asleep and didn't catch it, the Torah says the same thing in the very next pasuk. And it says, because he has despised the word of the Lord and has broken his commandment, that soul shall be utterly cut off. His iniquity shall be upon him. So again, right, the previous verse said, V'nichrata hanefesh, right, the soul be cut off. And then it repeats the same thing. Ki dvar Hashem bazar, he despised the word of the Lord. Vet mitzvato hefer, he has undone God's commandment. He karet, hanefesh, that soul shall be cut off. Now it's interesting that word karet, to be cut off, actually appears 3 times in these 2 psukim, right? V'nichrata nefesh, the soul be cut off. And then, for greater emphasis, hikaret tikaret, it shall surely be cut off. That's the way it's usually translated when we have this kind of form of hikaret tikaret or mot yamut, right? Surely. So 3 times that root appears. Nichrata and hikaret tikaret. Fine. Now we can understand the Gemara. Gemara says the following. Masechet Sanhedrin. It is stated with regard to one who blasphemes. Because he has despised the word of the Lord and has breached his mitzvah, that soul shall be cut off. Right? Hikaret tikaret. This is the foreign English that has translation kind of more words in there so that you can follow it easier. His iniquity shall be upon him. So that's our verse. Hikaret tikaret. The Gemara wants to know why that double language, hikaret tikaret. So in English, like I said before, we usually say it's for emphasis. Surely, shall surely be cut off. But that's not the way the Talmud deals with it. The phrase hikaret tikaret is interpreted as following. It says hikaret, the first time using in that double phrase, hikaret tikaret, the first usage. It's the sinner is cut off in this world, meaning he will die prematurely. Now, what about hikaret tikaret? The second repetition of that word in that pasuk. The sinner is cut off in the world to come, and he will not merit everlasting life. So hikaret tikaret is to tell you that a person who is a sinner will be cut off in this world and the next world, right? So the person will die prematurely in this world, and they won't merit eternal life in the next world. That's hikaret tikaret, cut off, cut off. This is the statement of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Yishmael said to him, wait a second. What about the previous verse? But isn't it already stated in the previous verse? He who blasphemes the Lord, that soul shall be cut off. Right? The previous verse said that the soul shall be cut off. So, as I pointed out, when we look through the 2 psukim, it actually appears 3 times. V'nichrata, it'll be cut off. Then the second period, second pasuk, hikaret tikaret. And so Rabbi Yishmael says almost cynically, are there 3 worlds in which the sinner is cut off? Right? If you're going to say that the repetition of the root to be cut off is alluding to the different worlds in which he's cut off, it's not just 2 times that root appears, it's 3 times. But we don't have 3 worlds. We have this world and the world to come. So what 3 worlds you're being cut off from? So that's a ridiculous approach, with all due respect, Rabbi Akiva. But I, Rabbi Yishmael, will give you a better interpretation. Rather, from the term in the verse, v'nichrata, it is derived that the sinner's is cut off in this world. From the term hikaret, it is derived the sinners are cut off in the world to come. So I agree with you, Rabbi Akiva, that there is an allusion to be cutting off from this world and the next world, but it's repeated 3 times. So hikaret tikaret. What about the tikaret? Right? We haven't interpreted that yet. The very last usage of that root. And nothing is derived from the doubled verb hikaret tikaret. As the Torah spoke in the language of people, we'll read it in the Hebrew. And what about the hikaret tikaret? The fact that it says tikaret, it repeats that verb. Dibra Torah l'shon b'nei Adam. Torah speaks in the language of men. So what is this? What does that mean? Torah speaks in the language of men. Here it means that when you have a root that's written twice, like mot yamut, he shall surely die. Hikaret tikaret, shall surely be cut off. the repetition of that root does not necessarily mean that it should be darshaned halachically or philosophically. It's just that the Torah is using a kind of figure of speech which is for emphasis. People say, Mot Yamut, he will surely die. And so the Torah uses that type of expression. And every single time that the Talmud uses the expression, Dibra Torah L'Shon B'nei Adam, Torah speaks the language of men, it's every single time exactly like this, where there's a dispute how to interpret a verb which appears twice. So there seems to be a redundancy. And one opinion will say the redundancy there is to tell you some halacha or some concept. And then the other opinion will say, no, the redundancy there is the way the Torah conveys that something should surely happen or shall definitely for emphasis, right? Like our example, hikare tikare. Never, ever does the Talmud use this expression, the Torah spoken language of people, in order to diffuse anthropomorphism, in order to say, oh, the reason the Torah says that God spoke to Moshe is because the Torah speaks the language of man. Or the reason that a prophet saw God sitting on a throne is because the Torah speaks the language of men. That expression has very limited and circumscribed meaning. It's always used, without exception, to describe a redundancy in the use of a root, and instead of using that redundancy in a midrashic way to bring in a halacha or perhaps a concept, like here you're cut off from another world, it's simply a literary expression to express the notion of surety.
Rabbi,
this is very disappointing.
Rabbi, like the Rambam say that it's so understood, it goes without saying.
Yeah. So I would rather have him say that than what he did say. Right? In other words, he could have said, like he does say, we saw him say, that whenever you have Tanakh that disagrees with a philosophically proven principle, you are forced to reinterpret that passage in Tanakh. Period. So I could accept that, based upon his premises, and what he thinks that logic is a foolproof method to arrive at truth. So, okay, if you think that, then if Scripture disagrees with truth that you got to through philosophical reasoning, so you reinterpret Scripture, fine. But he doesn't do that. I mean, he says that too, but then he says, even our sages believe this. As it says, the Torah speaks in metaphor, speaks the language of men, except for, as we just pointed out, that is a very technical expression, Torah speaks the language of men, which is only used, never any other example, in the sense of how to darshan when you have a root that appears twice. It's not at all dealing with saying that a description of God is only metaphor.
But what about Shira Shirim or we're all metaphor, I thought, or initially when clauses are doubled and they say that's just the style.
Okay, so when a clause is doubled, that's the style of Tanakh, right? It speaks the language of men. That is the use. That's the proper use of that term. But that notion, that principle, that interpretive principle, that the Torah speaks the language of men, and therefore describes God in human terms, that is not the meaning of that expression in the Talmud, ever. That was invented by the medieval rabbis in order to live with the idea that we have to take those psukim, which describe God physically, at face value. Now, we just began our topic today. This is going to last a few weeks, and I'm sorry to leave you with tension, but we saw passages in the Torah which seem to deny God's physicality. and also in the prophets. Same. But then we saw passages in the Torah and in the prophets and in the Talmud, which in a very crass and gross way describe God in physical terms. And we saw how the Rambam emphatically denies the literal meaning of those passages, as well as Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah dealt with it partly by saying that human beings can see something which God creates, kind of a phantom image, in order to make God more concrete and validate the prophetic message. The Rambam does not mention that particular principle, to the best of my knowledge. He just says it's all metaphor, and he bases upon this principle. And this principle then, after Rambam, by the way, he's not the first to use this principle in this way. Others have used it in this way. But it's from the Middle Ages that this principle all of a sudden is taken out of its Talmudic meaning and made to mean that the Torah uses metaphor, and then taking this idea to explain away the anthropomorphic passages in Tanakh or in the writing of our sages. So we will pause right here, and I hope you will go to sleep until our next session. We're going to dive very deeply, and we're going to have a very surprising take on this whole issue. And I'm going to make an argument. I'm just going to give away a little spoiler alert. As a result of a lot of investigation I've been doing the past 2 weeks, I'm going to make an argument for the validity of anthropomorphism. Not validity in the sense that it's a valid metaphor, but taking it face value.
Well, does the Ravid do that? Or does the Ravid say it's a wrong impression, but it's okay?
So the next week we're going to start off with the Ravid, and then use him as a kind of a window to explore a whole host of Rishonim who seem to suggest very different than the Rambam and very different than the Ravid. As you'll see, the Ravid is misunderstood. We'll take a look at the Ravid, but there's many more radical things than the Ravid, and we'll try to make an argument to convince all of us that the anthropomorphic images of God are meant to be taken at face value. And I know that sounds heretical and shocking, but just live with that suspense until next week. Okay, everybody. See you then. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.
Thank you.